Okay.
Good afternoon, professors. My research topic was the effect of motivation on the affective filter levels in EFL Chilean adult learners. So this was a case study. As a brief introduction, the context was where 24 students from first year commercial engineering at Grajales, and the purpose of this research was to find out why there are motivated students in the English class. And also, the purpose of this research was to find out the anxiety, inhibition, and self-esteem levels among the students. Some possible contributions of this research might be, first, to encourage students with high levels of anxiety, high levels of inhibition, and low levels of self-esteem to learn English. Another possible contribution is to establish a friendly and motivational environment in the class. Also, as an extra contribution of the research and applicable to the field, is to change and adapt lesson planning and lesson adaptation. The research question of my study is what are the emotional factors that can encourage Chilean learners to learn English in an adult context. The objectives, we have the general objective and two specific objectives. The general objective is to determine the relation between emotional factors and intrinsic motivation of EFL Chilean adult learners. Moving on to the specific objectives, these are two. First, to identify learners' most salient emotional factors present in an EFL classroom, and secondly, to identify and qualify the possible relation between motivation levels and salient emotional factors. Some keywords from the theoretical framework were identified as, first, motivation, emotional factors, anxiety, and self-esteem. Main authors or authors to consider from the theoretical framework, I consider those four. Gone stated that motivation can be considered as an influence or a stimulus that drives people to do a certain thing in their lives. Rachet and Dizzy considered that intrinsic motivation can be defined or can be said that it moves people to do things by inherent satisfaction. Scoville stated that anxiety is mostly considered as a negative feeling, such as frustration, self-doubt, and worry. And Cooper-Smith stated that self-esteem and inhibition are closely related, and those are rarely modified in adult stages unless the person has professional assessment. Okay, the methodological framework. The methodological approach and design. This study was under the qualitative paradigm and it was a case study research design. Okay, the methodological steps. This research study followed these steps. First, the setting and sample were determined, followed by the objectives, the general objective, and the specific objectives. After that, two instruments were designed, the observational chart and the Likert scale. Then, the information was organized, categorized, analyzed, and represented in graphs and charts. And finally, conclusions were drawn. Subjects. The subjects under study were accessed through Universidad Santo Tomás or UST practical program. These were 24 first-year commercial engineering students at the university context. Moving on to the data collection techniques. First, the observational chart had 10 different statements in which the aim of this tool was to identify the levels of anxiety, inhibition, and self-esteem. The Likert scale. The Likert scale had 8 different statements in which the student had to choose from totally disagree to totally agree, following his or her thoughts about the statements. And the aim of this tool was to identify the amount of motivated and non-motivated students in the classroom. Some considerations of scientific rigor. Validity. The considerations of this research study was by external validation. This means that there was a combination of instruments, two instruments, the observational chart and the Likert scale, The credibility of this study was assured because both instruments had different type of categories. For example, the observational chart had 3 categories as mentioned before: anxiety, self-esteem, and inhibition, and those categories had subcategories moving on to 0 to high levels. 0 levels of anxiety, low levels of anxiety, middle levels of anxiety, and high levels of anxiety. This is applicable to self-esteem and inhibition. And the Likert scale of agreement had a range from totally disagree, does not apply the statement to the participants' thoughts, agree, and totally agree. The general presentation of findings. As you can see, there is a chart from the observational chart that it shows 13 subjects under study, and the remarkable data shows that most of the subjects shows 0 levels of anxiety, low levels of inhibition, and high levels of self-esteem. On the Likert scale, 13 subjects under study showed a mode among the statements as totally agree with most of the statements. And as a result, there were 9 subjects, 9 motivated subjects, and 4 non-motivated subjects. Most relevant data analysis. From the observational chart, the most relevant data analysis were: most of the subjects avoided saying whether they understood and they were able to do the activities in the class. Rather, the minority of the subjects said that they were able to do the activity. This result might indicate that some of the students felt insecure about their abilities, and some of the students felt secure about their abilities, had high levels of self-esteem, and were inhibited. The second result, most of the participants were willing to work in groups but rejected public speech. This result might mean that those participants felt safe working in groups and felt safe supported by their peers regarding English knowledge and personality traits as self-esteem and anxiety. Most relevant data from the Likert scale were 2. Most of the participants totally agree with the idea of having had a great experience in the English class, Basic 2. This result might indicate that those participants felt comfortable in the class and they had connected with the professor, had a great relationship with the professor. The second result, all the subjects totally agree with the idea of English being important for job opportunities. This result might indicate that the subjects consider English important because they knew the future job requirements in our country. Results. As you can see from the observational chart, we have the results starting from the categories and the subcategories that I already mentioned and explained. The majority of the subjects shows 0 levels of anxiety, low levels of inhibition, and high levels of self-esteem. From the Likert scale, as mentioned before, from the categories of motivated and non-motivated, as a researcher, I obtained 9 motivated students in the class and 4 non-motivated students in the class. Some conclusions were drawn from the research study. 2 major conclusions. First, most of the participants who felt inhibited in the class correlated with the category of being non-motivated students in the class. And secondly, most of the participants preferred groups, as I mentioned before, because they felt safe and supported by their peers regarding English knowledge and personality traits. They avoided individual tasks and activities. Some recommendations. It is advisable to further examine concepts which are related or involved with constructive motivation, and also to research on other emotional factors that might be present in this context, adult context and other type of context as secondary and primary at hand, which might be, as an example, self-efficacy, self-confidence. Limitations. As a researcher, I could identify 3 main limitations of the research project, which were time constraints, amount of subjects under study, and different emotional factors to analyze. to further research. It is advisable to do further research on external circumstances that may explain why the student is not motivated in an English class. Regarding the metacognitive analysis, considering the perspective or the point of view of strategy, I did my interventions considering extra material in case a student finished the activity earlier or in case that specific activity does not work in the class. Also, I did my lesson planning and my interventions considering pre-activities, while activities, and post-activities. Pre-activities as an introductory activities, that is to say, lexis or introducing the topic, while activities as the main activity, developing activity, the analyzing and top activity in the class, and final, the post-activity as a reflective and closure activity of the lesson. Then, regarding the available resources, I took into consideration paper-based activities as guidance, PowerPoint presentations, the whiteboard using as an explanatory available resource, and finally, I did a research project in which the students had to present a country, talk about the most important features of that country, and bring a food sample to the students. And finally, regarding the closure of my activities and my lesson planning, I did checking comprehension questions after each lesson plan in order to see and revise if the students really understood the topic instead of saying, yes, I understood, just because saying it. So I had to make sure about their learning in that class. And consider also the seminar course at seminar level. One of my main weaknesses was time constraints by doing all the reports. And one of the challenges and most important challenges in the seminar course was to have the permanent guidance of my advisor and also consider my peers' feedback. And these are my references from my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.